The first thing you should know is that I found out about the theft on a Tuesday, which is exactly the kind of day something like this happens on. Not a dramatic Friday, not a storm-drenched Sunday, a Tuesday. While I was eating leftover pad thai at my desk and reviewing a probate filing for a client whose family was considerably less creative in their greed than mine would turn out to be. The second thing you should know is that I am a probate attorney. And the third thing, the thing that will make everything that follows either very satisfying or very uncomfortable, depending on which side of a trust document you've ever sat on, is that my grandmother knew exactly what she was doing when she left the money to me, and my sister knew exactly what she was doing when she spent it, and I knew exactly what I was doing when I spent the next 14 months making sure that distinction had consequences. My name is irrelevant. You can call me the narrator. My sister's name is Celeste, which she chose herself at 22 after deciding that her birth name, Karen, was, and I'm quoting directly here, a vibe I'm not interested in carrying forward. This is the kind of person we are dealing with, a woman who legally renamed herself away from a vibe. I say this not to be unkind, but because it is genuinely load-bearing information for the story I'm about to tell you. Our grandmother, Grandma Roz, Rosalind Eleanor Marchetti, née Kowalski, died in October 3 years ago, at the age of 89, in the house on Geneva Lake in Williams Bay, Wisconsin, in a hospital bed that had been wheeled into the sunroom so she could watch the water. She had been a pharmacist for 40 years, widowed young, and had quietly accumulated roughly $2.3 million across a portfolio she managed herself using a yellow legal pad and a subscription to the Wall Street Journal that she maintained until the last year of her life. She smelled like Chanel No. 5 and antibiotic cream, and she once told me that the secret to financial independence was to want less than men assumed you wanted, and then want it anyway, quietly, in the background, where no one would try to talk you out of it. She loved Celeste. I want to say that clearly, before any of you decide this is a story about a grandmother playing favorites, because it's not, or at least, it's not only that. Grandma Roz loved Celeste the way you love a beautiful, expensive, slightly impractical thing that keeps needing maintenance. She loved her the way she loved her 1987 Mercedes, which she also kept running far past the point of economic sense. She just also trusted me. And those are different things. The trust, the legal document, the Rosalind E. Marchetti Revocable Living Trust, named me as the primary beneficiary for the residual estate after specific bequests. Celeste received $50,000 outright and a set of pearl earrings that had belonged to our great-grandmother. The split was not an accident. Grandma Roz had 2 attorneys review that document, and she had the capacity evaluation in writing. She had thought about this. I know because she told me. 2 weeks before she died, on one of the last afternoons she was really lucid, she held my hand in that sunroom and said, "I'm leaving the bulk to you because you'll know what to do with it, and because you've already been doing without for long enough." I didn't ask what she meant by the second part. I thought I knew. I was 34 years old, living in a 1-bedroom in Milwaukee, billing 60-hour weeks, paying off law school debt that had metastasized in the way law school debt does. I thought she meant the money would help me breathe. She did mean that. She also meant something else. Something I wouldn't understand until 14 months later when I finally pulled the full trust accounting and saw what had happened to $120,000 of it while the estate was still in administration. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the wedding first, because you need to understand the wedding to understand the audacity, and you need to understand the audacity to understand why. When I eventually did what I did, not a single person in my professional life questioned my methods, even if several people in my personal life never fully forgave me for them. Celeste announced her engagement to a man named Thaddeus, Thad, in January of the year Grandma Roz died. Thad was 38, worked in consulting, in the way that people who have never fully explained their income work in consulting, had a jaw that belonged on a watch advertisement, and was the kind of person who said "we summer" as a verb. I'm not going to tell you I disliked him immediately because that would be dishonest. I disliked him at roughly the 40-minute mark of our first dinner, when he interrupted Grandma Roz, who was 88 years old and was telling a story about the summer of 1973, to offer his opinion on the Federal Reserve. That's when I disliked him. The first 40 minutes he was simply generic. The engagement party was in February, at my parents' house in Naperville, and it was the first time I noticed the scope of what Celeste was imagining for this wedding. There was a vision board, an actual, physical, laminated vision board that she carried in a portfolio case and unfolded on the dining room table after dinner. Lake Geneva venue. She had already toured 3. Florist from Chicago's Gold Coast who charged what I would have described, professionally, as a facially unreasonable sum for centerpieces. A dress she'd found in New York, a rehearsal dinner the night before, and a brunch the morning after, and a welcome bag situation she described with the quiet intensity of someone diffusing a bomb. My mother looked at this vision board with the expression she reserves for things she finds overwhelming but cannot bring herself to oppose. My father said, "Wow, Sally," in a tone that walked the line between impressed and frightened. I said, "What's the budget?" Which is exactly the wrong thing to say and also the only rational thing to say, and this is the central tension of being me at a family dinner. Celeste looked at me. She had Grandma Roz's dark eyes, and in certain lights, in certain moments, the resemblance was enough to make your chest ache. This was not one of those moments. In this moment, she looked at me the way she had looked at me since we were children, like I was a particularly stubborn piece of weather she had learned to plan around. "We're still working on the numbers," she said. "The florist alone on this board is probably $18,000 to $20,000, I said. "Rachel," my mother said. That's my name. Rachel. I mention it now because you've probably been waiting for it and because it's relevant that Celeste got to rename herself, and I remained, stubbornly, Rachel. A name that means you, as in the sheep, which has always seemed cosmically unfair given how this family operates. "I'm just asking about the budget," I said. "The budget," Celeste said carefully, "is being handled." I did not ask what that meant. I should have. This is my fallibility and I am aware of it. I am extremely good at reading documents and extremely bad at reading rooms, and specifically I am bad at pressing for information in family settings because some part of me still reverts, in my parents' dining room, to the child who learned that asking too many questions was called being difficult, and being difficult had social costs I was not always willing to pay. So I looked at the vision board. I noted the venue, the Sprecher Estate, a private property on the north shore of Geneva Lake that I happened to know rented for somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000 for a weekend. I noted the florist. I noted the phrase string quartet and DJ coexisting in the same event timeline. And then I folded that information somewhere in the back of my mind, and I let the dinner continue, and I ate my mother's pot roast, and I drove home thinking about something else. This is the part I will not get back. Not the money. The money, eventually, was recoverable, or at least accountable. What I won't get back is the 6 months I spent not knowing. The 6 months I was working 70-hour weeks, eating pad thai over case files, sending my student loan servicer money I felt in my nerve endings, while somewhere across the legal machinery of my grandmother's estate, someone was making decisions that would have made Grandma Roz's careful, quiet voice go very cold and very flat. I won't get those months back, but I'll tell you what I did with the months that came after. Grandma Roz died on October 14th, on a Thursday, with the lake light coming through the sunroom windows at a specific angle that I have not been able to describe to anyone without my voice doing something I don't love. The house smelled like the candles she burned, balsam, and something mineral, like cold water. And the hospice nurse had stepped out, and it was just me and my mother and Celeste and the sound of the lake, which doesn't stop. Geneva Lake does not have tides, but it has a constancy that I have always found either comforting or brutal depending on the circumstances. And that afternoon, it was both simultaneously. Celeste cried in a way that was real. I want to say that. Whatever came later, whatever she did, and whatever she told herself about why she did it, in that sunroom, her grief was genuine. She held Grandma Roz's hand and she said, "I wish you could see the wedding." And she meant it, and I believed her, and I still believe her. And I also still believe that she then spent the next 8 months doing something that would have made Grandma Roz change her passwords and call her attorney on a Saturday morning. Both things are true. This is the part my family never forgave me for understanding. The estate went into formal administration in November. I was named co-trustee alongside my mother, which was standard. Grandma Roz had wanted a family member and a neutral party, but the neutral party she'd named, her longtime accountant, Gerald Hofstetter, had retired and moved to Tucson, and the replacement process stalled. And so it was me and my mother, which in retrospect was like assigning the fire department to co-manage an arson investigation with the person who bought the matches. My mother is not a bad person. She is a person who loves her children with a completeness that makes her fundamentally unable to audit them. This is a lovely quality in a parent and a catastrophic one in a fiduciary. I trusted her. This is the other part of my fallibility, the part that's harder to say. I trusted my mother to handle the administrative mechanics because I was busy, because I was grieving in the low-frequency way I grieve things, because I told myself that a revocable living trust with clear beneficiary designations was not a complex instrument. And my mother had been watching me practice law for 6 years, and surely she understood the basic principle that trust assets belong to the beneficiaries and not to whoever happens to find the checkbook. Surely. Here is what I did not know yet, sitting at my desk on that Tuesday in December eating pad thai. In the 11 months since Grandma Roz's death, my mother had approved, in her capacity as co-trustee, a series of disbursements from the trust account totaling $120,000. The disbursements were categorized in the trust's internal ledger, which I had not yet reviewed because the formal accounting wasn't due until the trust's first anniversary, and I had been, as I have mentioned, busy and grieving, and apparently operating under the catastrophically incorrect assumption that nothing interesting was happening. The categorization in the ledger, which I eventually obtained, and which I have since memorized the way you memorize the details of a car accident, read as follows. Advance distribution to Rachel M. per trustee discretion for family event contribution, per Section 4, B, of trust instrument. Section 4, by B. Let me tell you about Section 4, B. Section 4, B, of the Rosalind E. Marchetti Revocable Living Trust authorized the trustee to make discretionary distributions to the primary beneficiary for health, education, maintenance, and support. It is what attorneys call a HEMS standard. It is extremely common. It is also, and I cannot stress this enough, not a provision that authorizes a trustee to take money designated for one beneficiary and spend it on another beneficiary's wedding catering. But that framing, advance distribution to Rachel M., was the thing that almost made me put down my fork. Because if you read it quickly, if you were a probate judge doing a routine review, if you were anyone who wasn't a probate attorney looking at her own trust accounting, It looked like the money had gone to me. It was disguised as my distribution. My name was on the ledger. The implication, sitting there in 12-point font, was that I had received $120,000 from my grandmother's trust and spent it on what? My own lifestyle? My expenses? And if anyone ever asked, the family could say, "Oh, Rachel got her distribution early, and now she's complaining." This is the part of the story where I put down my fork. I want to describe that moment accurately, because I think about it sometimes when I'm in court and I need to remember what it feels like to be on the other side of a document. The pad thai went cold. The office was quiet. It was around 7 in the evening and the other attorneys had gone home. The window behind my desk faced west, and the December light was doing its thing, going orange and low. And I sat there with the trust accounting on my screen, and I felt something happen to my understanding of the previous 11 months that I can only describe as a recalibration. Like when you've been looking at an optical illusion one way, and then you see the other image and you can't unsee it. The whole year rearranged itself. Every wedding update text from Celeste. Every time my mother had said, "Don't worry, it's all being handled." Every polite non-answer to every budget question. The vision board, laminated and portfolio cased, sitting on my parents' dining room table in February like a declaration of intent. My sister had planned a wedding. I had been, without my knowledge, designated to pay for it. And the paper trail had been constructed to make that look like my idea. I closed the accounting file. I opened a new document. And then I did something that I think is the truest thing I have ever done in my professional life. I billed myself. Not in the accounting sense. I opened a new client file, labeled it in Re Marchetti Trust, assigned it a matter number, and began entering time. Because here is what my family did not understand, and what Celeste did not understand, and what my mother, who approved 12 separate trust disbursements over 11 months without calling me once, fundamentally did not understand. I am not sentimental about legal documents. I am precise about them. And there is a difference between those two things that was about to cost my family considerably more than $120,000 in stress, legal exposure, and the specific social currency that gets spent when the family scapegoat turns out to have been right about everything, in writing, with citations. Let me tell you about the wedding itself, because I attended it, which is the detail that I think surprises people most when I tell this story. I went to the wedding. I wore a green dress that Grandma Roz would have approved of. I sat in the second row on the bride's side at the Sprecher estate on the north shore of Geneva Lake on a Saturday in June, 2 weeks before I filed the formal petition. And I watched my sister marry Thaddeus in front of 212 guests, with a string quartet playing during the ceremony and a DJ who charged $4,000 for 4 hours and a floral installation above the ceremony arch that I had, by that point, personally traced to an invoice for $22,400. I know the exact number because I had requested and received every vendor invoice as part of my pre-filing discovery process, which I had been conducting for 6 weeks by the time I sat in that white folding chair. I had a folder at home, a literal manila folder, because some things deserve physical form, that contained printouts of 17 vendor contracts, 4 trust disbursement authorizations signed by my mother, a bank statement showing the trust account's outgoing transactions, and a 3-page memo I had written to myself laying out the legal theory of the case. The memo was thorough. I write thorough memos. It's a professional hazard. The ceremony was beautiful. I want to say that too. The lake was doing what Geneva Lake does on a perfect June day. That specific blue that's almost aqua near the shore and goes dark and still further out. And the Sprecher property has a lawn that slopes down to a private dock, And the light on the water in the late afternoon is the kind of light that makes you understand why people pay $12,000 to rent a venue for a weekend. The flowers were extraordinary, which you'd expect for $22,400. Celeste was radiant in a dress that cost, I had the receipt, $8,700, alterations included. Thad cried during his vows. Genuinely. Tears running down that advertisement jaw, voice cracking at the part about choosing her every day. I noted this in the category of humanizing details and filed it alongside his Federal Reserve opinions and the way he'd called Grandma Roz's house the property during estate discussions, as though it were an asset class and not a place where someone had lived for 50 years. My mother found me during cocktail hour, holding a glass of Prosecco she'd probably paid for with money that was notionally mine, and she touched my arm and said, "She looks so happy." "She does," I said. "Your grandmother would have loved this." I looked at the lake. A sailboat was moving slowly across the far edge of the water, and the sound of the string quartet had given way to something ambient and low from the speakers, and there were fireflies beginning to come up in the grass near the tree line, which happens early at Geneva Lake in June because of something about the humidity and the temperature differential off the water. Grandma Roz had loved the fireflies. She used to say they were the lake's way of showing off. She would have had opinions about the budget, I said. My mother's hand tightened slightly on my arm. "Rachel, I'm not starting anything, Mom. I'm just saying she was careful with money. It's her granddaughter's wedding. It's also," I said, keeping my voice entirely level, "the subject of a document I need to discuss with you next week." My mother looked at me. And here is the thing about my mother. Here is the humanizing moment that I carry with me, because it complicates everything I did afterward in the way that true things complicate clean narratives. She looked at me and I saw, very briefly, that she knew. Not everything, not the legal exposure, not the specific sections of trust law that were implicated, not the phrase breach of fiduciary duty, and what it would mean when I said it in a formal letter. But she knew that something had been done that she had allowed, and she knew that I was the person it had been done to, and she knew that the fact of my sitting in this chair at this wedding in this green dress was costing me something she couldn't name but could feel. She didn't say anything else. She went back to the reception, and I stood by the lake for a few minutes, and the fireflies kept coming up in the grass. And then I went back too, because I had promised myself I would stay for the first dance. I need to tell you about the open question now, the one I planted in Act 3 that I promised I would only answer here. Do you remember it? I mentioned that Grandma Roz had said I'd been doing without for long enough, and that I thought I knew what she meant, but that she also meant something else. I said I wouldn't understand it until I pulled the full trust accounting. That's only partially true. I understood the financial part of it when I pulled the accounting. What I didn't understand until later, until deep into the investigation, when I requested Grandma Roz's personal correspondence as part of building the estate's administrative record, was that she had known. Not about the wedding, obviously. She died before the engagement was even announced. But she had known, in the way that old women who have watched their families for 60 years know things, that Celeste's need for things was structural, bottomless in a specific way, and she had known. This is in a letter she wrote to Gerald Hofstetter in 2019. A letter I read sitting at my kitchen table at midnight with cold coffee going stale beside me. That if she left the estate to both daughters equally, the operational chaos of that split would find a way to funnel resources toward the louder need. She wrote, and I am paraphrasing because I do not reproduce correspondence verbatim, even in YouTube narration. She wrote something to the effect that Rachel is precise and will protect herself, but only if the instrument gives her something unambiguous to protect. Give her the clarity, and she'll do the rest. She gave me the clarity. She was right about what I would do with it. I'm not sure if that makes me feel better or if it makes me miss her more. Probably both. Probably that's the honest answer. The formal petition was filed on July 7th, a Wednesday, which is marginally more dramatic than a Tuesday. I filed it personally, which attorneys are technically permitted to do but rarely choose to because there is something uncomfortable about using your professional skills against your own family, and most people prefer the emotional distance of a hired advocate. I did not want distance. I wanted precision. The petition alleged breach of fiduciary duty against my mother in her capacity as co-trustee, sought a full accounting of all trust disbursements since the date of death, requested a constructive trust over the $120,000 in disbursements made for the benefit of Celeste's wedding, and named Celeste as a necessary party given that she had received the benefit of the allegedly improper distributions. I served my mother by certified mail, which was the legally correct method, and also, I will acknowledge, the emotionally nuclear method. She called me 45 minutes after the green card came back. I was in my car outside a coffee shop. I remember the angle of the afternoon sun and the way someone's windshield chime kept going in the parking lot. "What is this?" she said. "It's a formal petition," I said. "I need you to read it carefully. Pay particular attention to the sections on fiduciary duty and the accounting request. Rachel, you're suing your family. I'm petitioning the probate court for an accounting of my grandmother's trust. That is a procedural remedy that is specifically designed for... You're suing your mother." I sat with that for a second. I'm holding the trustee of Grandma Roz's estate accountable for actions taken in that capacity. If you had approved these disbursements in your role as, I don't know, a friend or a mother, this would be different. But you approved them as a trustee. That's a legal hat. I'm addressing the hat. Silence. "The hat," she said. "It's a legal concept. It's about the capacity in which..." "I know what a fiduciary is, Rachel." "Then you know why I had to file this." More silence. The wind chime kept going. Someone walked past my car, with a dog on a very long leash. "Celeste is going to think you're trying to destroy her marriage," my mother said. "Celeste is going to think that because it's easier than thinking about what the ledger actually says," I said, "which is that someone spent $120,000 of my inheritance on a wedding and then documented it as my distribution so that if anyone looked at the trust accounting, it would appear that I had already received the money." I heard my mother breathe. That's not what was intended." "What was intended and what was documented are two different things," I said. "And in probate court, the document is what we work with." This is the line I've thought about most in the 2 years since. What was intended and what was documented. It's a true statement about law, and it's a true statement about my family, and it might be a true statement about the gap between those two things in general. The distance between what people mean to do and what actually ends up in writing, in records, in the permanent, subpoenable, court-admissible record of what happened. My family meant to give Celeste the wedding she wanted. They also meant to use my money to do it, and they also meant, whether consciously or through the motivated reasoning of people who needed it to be okay, to document it in a way that would survive scrutiny. They were wrong about the scrutiny part. They underestimated what scrutiny actually looks like when the person doing it passed the bar. The discovery phase was, professionally speaking, one of the more interesting exercises of my career, which is a sentence I recognize sounds unhinged, but which I offer in the spirit of radical honesty. I subpoenaed the trust account records from the bank. I requested all correspondence between my mother and the vendors directly, which she had accessed and contracted using trust funds, meaning the correspondence was discoverable. I obtained the venue contract, signed by my mother on behalf of the Marchetti Trust. I obtained the catering invoice, $48,000, and I want that to land for a second. $48,000 for food at a wedding that was not mine, billed to a trust set up by a woman who had managed her own grocery budget with the same yellow legal pad she used for her stock portfolio. The florist invoice, $22,400. The dress, $8,700. Photography and videography, $9,500. The DJ, $4,000. Rehearsal dinner at a restaurant in Lake Geneva proper, $6,800. Welcome bags for out-of-town guests, a detail that I found genuinely operationally impressive in retrospect. $3,600. Hair and makeup for the bridal party, all 8 members, $2,200. Miscellaneous vendor fees, permits, tent rental, lighting, $14,800. Total, $120,000. It was almost exactly $120,000. Not in the sense of sloppy rounding, in the sense that someone had looked at the trust's available liquid assets and calculated what could be taken without triggering the formal accounting thresholds that would have required my co-trustee approval. My mother was sophisticated enough, or had been advised well enough, to understand that disbursements over a certain threshold required both co-trustees to sign. She had structured the disbursements in tranches, 11 separate payments over 8 months, each one just under the threshold. It was not an accident. It was not sloppiness. It was a plan. I put this in the petition's supplemental brief. I wrote it in the flat, precise language of legal filings, which is a language specifically designed to remove emotion from facts while making the facts as devastating as possible. I described the pattern of disbursements. I described the tranche structure. I described the documentation that labeled everything as my advance distribution. And then I did the thing that I think Celeste, when she eventually read the filing, found most unforgivable. I included a timeline, a month-by-month timeline from October, when Grandma Roz died, to June, when the wedding happened. On the left side, trust disbursements, dates, amounts, stated purpose. On the right side, corresponding wedding vendor payments, dates, amounts, vendor names, a visual, documented, court-filed demonstration that every dollar taken from my grandmother's estate in the name of my distribution had a receipt attached to it for a chair rental or a florist invoice or $48,000 worth of food I did not eat. Timelines are a tool. They do not editorialize. They simply insist that everything happened in order, that the order matters, and that the order is visible to anyone who looks. Celeste called me 2 days after the supplemental brief was filed, on a Sunday morning when I was making coffee and watching the Milwaukee River from my window. I had been expecting the call in the way you expect weather, not the exact timing, but the inevitability. "I need you to explain what you think you're doing," she said. The word think was doing a lot of work in that sentence. "I'm pursuing a legal remedy for an improper disbursement from our grandmother's trust," I said. "You're trying to destroy my marriage. Celeste." I put down my coffee. I have 17 vendor invoices. I have 4 trustee authorization forms. I have an 11-month disbursement record. I have a timeline. This is not about your marriage. You're doing this because you've always been jealous. This is the moment that I want to describe carefully, because I think it's the one that tells you the most about both of us. Not the legal maneuvering, not the document discovery, not the courtroom. This moment, on a Sunday morning, on the phone with my sister, when she said the word jealous and I felt something that was not anger, and was not hurt, and was not the cold, mechanical forward motion of a legal case. It was something older than all of that. It was the feeling of being 14 and being told that I was difficult when I was right, that I was competitive when I had evidence, that I was making things up when I was simply describing what had happened with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention. "I'm jealous of the $120,000, I said. "Yes, that's accurate." A pause. "That money was going to help me pay off my student loans," I said, "which I've been paying for 9 years. Grandma Roz knew that. She knew what the money meant. She wrote about it. I have the letter." "You have a—" "What letter?" "A letter she wrote to her accountant in 2019, about why she left the estate the way she did, about what she hoped the distribution would do for me." I paused. "I can include it in the evidentiary record if that's helpful." Silence that had a different quality than the earlier silence. "She never said anything to me," Celeste said. Her voice had changed. The brittleness had gone somewhere else, and what was underneath it was something I had not expected. Not guilt exactly, but something that was adjacent to grief, which is its own form of complication. "She didn't tell me either," I said. "I found out the same way you're finding out, from a document she left behind." "Rachel—" "Celeste, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because $120,000 is a real number and it was meant for me and it's gone, and the legal remedy for that is what it is. If you want to talk about a settlement that avoids the full accounting proceeding, my attorney—" "I have retained an outside attorney because I have too many professional conflicts to represent myself in litigation against my own family. My attorney can schedule a call." "You retained someone?" "I said I can't represent myself. Oh my God. And here's the thing. Here's the humanizing moment I promised you. The moment that Celeste, who renamed herself away from a vibe and carried a laminated vision board and spent my inheritance on a tent and a DJ, became something more complicated than a villain." She made a sound on the phone that was not quite crying and not quite laughing and was entirely human. "Mom said you'd understand," she said. She said you'd never be the type to actually do anything. You'd just be upset, and eventually you'd get over it because you always did." I let that sit for a long time. "She was probably right, historically," I said. "I usually got over it. Yeah. I'm not getting over this one. The mediation was in October, exactly 1 year after Grandma Roz died, which I did not plan but which the scheduling worked out to, and which I noted with the private, dark humor of someone who has spent a year living inside her grandmother's estate administration. The mediator was a retired judge named Harriet, who had the efficient kindness of a woman who has spent 40 years watching families fight over money and has reached the equanimity that comes from having seen every version of this story. My mother came with her personal attorney. Celeste came with Thad, which the mediator gently discouraged as a practice but could not legally prevent. My attorney, Denise, who I had retained because she was the best trust litigation attorney in Milwaukee, and because she had reviewed my petition and said, with the professional flatness of someone delivering a diagnosis, "You have an extremely strong case," sat beside me. The opening positions were predictable. My mother's attorney argued that the disbursements had been made in good faith, that Celeste was family, that the trust's HEMS language provided some discretion, and that the documentation, yes, the documentation labeling everything as my distribution, had been a clerical shorthand that did not reflect intent. Denise responded with the timeline. She put it on the table in color. I had printed it in color, specifically, and she let everyone look at it for a while before she said anything. "The trust document," she said, "does not provide the co-trustee discretion to reclassify disbursements after the fact. The HEMS standard requires that distributions benefit the named beneficiary. The disbursements at issue were made for the benefit of a third party and documented in a manner that misrepresents their purpose. We're prepared to request a full surcharge proceeding if we don't reach a settlement today." A surcharge proceeding, for those of you who have not spent your careers in probate. It's the mechanism by which a court can hold a trustee personally liable for losses caused by a breach of fiduciary duty. Personally liable means out of pocket, out of personal assets, not out of the trust's assets, out of my mother's own money. My mother's attorney knew this. My mother, to judge from the way she looked at the table when Denise said the word surcharge, also knew it. Thad, who had been sitting slightly behind Celeste with his advertisement jaw set at what I can only describe as a defensive angle, said, "This is insane." "Thad," Celeste said, "no, this is genuinely insane. Rachel is sitting here threatening her own mother with a lawsuit over a wedding that's already happened." "The wedding has already happened," Denise said pleasantly, "which is why we're in mediation rather than seeking an injunction. The question now is remediation." "Rachel," my mother said. She looked at me the way she had looked at me at the cocktail hour, with the lake behind me and the fireflies coming up in the grass. The same expression that knew something it couldn't name. "Is this really what you want?" I had been thinking about this question for a year. I had thought about it making coffee in the morning and billing hours at night and driving on the highway with the radio off because silence is easier for thinking than music. I had thought about what I wanted and what I was owed and whether those were the same thing and whether the answer to my mother's question was something that could coexist with the answer to the question of what Grandma Roz would have wanted me to do. Here's what I concluded. Grandma Roz did not leave me a trust fund and a letter and a careful, legally reviewed document because she wanted me to absorb the theft of it, quietly, and get over it eventually, the way I always did. She left me an instrument specifically because she believed I was the kind of person who would protect it. Give her the clarity, and she'll do the rest. She gave me the clarity. The clarity said $120,000. The rest was the work I'd been training for. "Yes," I said. "This is what I want, a full accounting and remediation. I'd prefer we settle it here, but I'm comfortable with a surcharge proceeding if we don't." The settlement was reached by 4 in the afternoon. The terms included a repayment schedule from the trust estate's remaining assets to the primary beneficiary, meaning me, for the full $120,000 over 24 months, structured as an interest-bearing repayment, with a rate that Denise had pulled from applicable Wisconsin statute. It included a formal accounting of all other trust disbursements, which revealed 2 smaller disbursements I had not yet found, totaling $8,400, which were added to the remediation amount. It included my mother's formal resignation as co-trustee, replaced by a professional trustee, a bank trust department, for the remainder of the estate's administration. And it included, because I insisted, a formal notation in the trust's records that the previous documentation had been inaccurate, and that the disbursements at issue had been made for the benefit of Celeste's wedding, and not as a distribution to Rachel. This last item cost nothing. It was just words. But I wanted the record to say what had happened, because records are what remain after all the intentions and explanations and family dynamics dissolve. And I had learned, the hard way and the thorough way, that accuracy has a permanence that nothing else quite does. My mother did not speak to me for 4 months after the settlement. Celeste did not speak to me for 6. Thad, to his credit, sent me a 1-line email 3 weeks after mediation that said, "I didn't know, and nothing else, and I believe him, and I don't hold him responsible, and I think the Federal Reserve opinions are still wrong, but that's neither here nor there." My father called me on the second Tuesday in November and said, "I want you to know I think you were right." He said it in the exact tone of a man who has been wanting to say something for a year and has finally decided the cost of silence is higher than the cost of saying it. My father had not been involved in any of the trust administration. He was not a fiduciary. He was a man who had watched his wife and daughter do something he couldn't stop, and who had been carrying that for 12 months, and who called me on a Tuesday in November when the light goes early and said what he could. "I know, Dad," I said. "Your grandmother—" "I know," I said. "I know." The money came in the first installment in January. $5,000, deposited directly to my account from the trust estate. I had calculated, when the settlement was signed, that the full repayment plus my outstanding student loan balance would arrive at something close to equilibrium around month 19 of the schedule. Close enough. Not everything, but close enough. Grandma Roz's yellow legal pad calculation, translated into a payment schedule by a bank trust department in a city that wasn't even Geneva Lake. I am sitting, as I tell you this story, in the sunroom of the house on Geneva Lake, which I am renting for a long weekend with the first installment and some money I saved because I wanted to be here for this part of the telling. The lake is doing what it does, that specific blue, dark further out. The light moving on the water. It's October again. The balsam candles I bought smell close but not exactly right. Nothing smells exactly right except the thing itself. My family thinks I was vindictive. This opinion is widely held and openly expressed, and I have heard it at 3 separate holiday events since the settlement, in the way that family opinions are circulated, imprecisely, with the emotional resonance of someone who is describing injury rather than fact. Vindictive. She was vindictive. She sued her own mother. I want to close with the distinction that I think is the actual subject of this story, the one that Grandma Roz saw from the beginning, the one she tried to build into the document itself. Vindictive is when you cause harm beyond what the situation requires. Precise is when you cause exactly as much harm as the situation requires, documented and justified and proportionate to what was done. The situation required $120,000 in remediation, a formal accounting, and a record that said the truth. The record says the truth. The family thinks I was vindictive. I think I was my grandmother's granddaughter. The difference costs them. And somewhere on Geneva Lake tonight, the fireflies are coming up in the grass near the tree line, and I can see them from the sunroom window, and I have not yet decided whether I will tell the rest of the family that I was here, or whether I'll keep this part. Just the lake. Just the light. Just the accurate, unambiguous, court-filed record of what happened. For myself.